So much of it is about identification, and it's about moving into wider and wider expanses of identification. And when we're in these narrow fields of identification, that's when there's pain and there's suffering, because we're feeling restricted and constricted. Because in our essence, we know there's something beyond the narrow confines that we're creating by our minds, which we find ourselves in. And this is what we call the ego. And the ego is this illusionary sense of a separate self. And it's like we're creating our own prison cell without realizing that we're doing so. And for some of us, it becomes smaller and smaller. It becomes this little box that we're stuck. We're stuck and we're constricted inside. And the prison bars are these rigid self-concepts we have about ourselves, these limiting beliefs we have about ourselves, these limiting thought patterns we have about ourselves, and that they're like the key to the prison cell, that we lock ourselves inside these limiting belief systems, these limiting thought patterns. And this is the common way of living in the world, so there's this common sense of people identifying themselves in certain ways. And some of the ways may seem very negative, and some of the ways may seem very positive, but they're all limiting. This is when you get to a whole deeper level, like I was talking about. This is like a whole deeper level of spiritual liberation, and emancipation, and self-realization. And it's this realization that whatever kind of identification that we attach ourselves to, it's like we're putting ourselves in a box. And so we may say that for example, one would be I'm not smart, I'm stupid, or I'm not attractive, or I don't have, I'm not abundant, right? So then you can have other concepts, which is I'm smart, and I'm beautiful, and I'm financially abundant, and I'm wealthy, and those are better than the first because they're more expansive. So now we're creating a wider space that we can live in, that we can move around in. There's more space. There's much more space in those forms of identification than in the first forms of identification. But what happens when we put ourselves into a situation where our self-identification is called into question? So, for example, about being smart or being intelligent. What if we put ourselves what if we're put into a situation where we don't know something? Can we have the humility to acknowledge that we don't know it, so that we can continue to learn and grow? Not if we're stuck in this concept that we have to always be smart, we have to always look smart and present ourselves as smart, and look intelligent and present ourselves as intelligent, and it becomes its own kind of prison cell, becomes its own kind of jail cell. So any kind of identification that we have, that we're stuck to, that we're attached to, that is not flexible and fluid, becomes limiting at a certain point. Even the ones that are positive, the ones that seem positive. So the same thing if we're having attachment to physical attraction. If something happens, if I get hit by a bus or something, and my face is mangled, then that identification I was attached to is taking away, and there's this kind of clinging to something that we want to maintain the psychological attachment to. But anything in this world, in the world of form, is constantly moving and changing and flowing. And there's nothing static in the world of form. Everything is flowing and moving all the time. Wealth, money, it's just a number in the bank that's constantly moving up and down, right? So if we're attached to a number in a bank, or we're attached to a certain amount of material possessions that we can show our wealth to people, there's a time when those are not there. And if we're attached to that, then there's this fear. First of all, in all these cases, there's a fear of loss. There's this constant underlying anxiety of losing what we have, because our self-worth is attached to identification with these different concepts that allow us to have a sense of self-worth in the world when we present ourselves to others and when we relate ourselves to others. And so we're just basing our self-worth, our sense of self-love, on these external little pieces, these little prison bars, right? And when they go, it's like that self-worth, that self-love goes with it, because that's what we were attaching ourselves to. And sometimes we don't know that we're attaching ourselves to it until the situation arises when we lose it. And then we realize, oh, I was attaching my self-worth, my value, my self-love to this psychological identification, and that has been taken away, and now, I don't know, I feel like I'm lost, I feel like I'm lost, but that's actually an opportunity, because any kind of psychological attachment that we have at some point is going to be confronted, and it's going to be lost, because it's not our true nature. So what I'm suggesting is actually having no sense of identification, of self-identification at all with anything, because whatever we see is a reflection. When you come to this higher level of consciousness, this spiritual liberation, everything that we see is a reflection of spirit. Everything that we see, everything that we experience, everything that we sense is a reflection of God. Everything that we see, everything that we experience, everything that we sense is a reflection of Source. So from that realization as the foundation, as the grounding point, there's no need to be identified with anything in particular, because whatever is arising is a reflection of God. And from this highest level of consciousness, this highest, truest, deepest level of spiritual realization, the reflection of God is the reflection of me, of self. So what we call the small self with the lowercase s, this little sphere here, and the big self, which is God, Spirit, Source, multiple names for it. Choose your name, and whatever name you choose is not actually what it is, by the way. So we're aligned with that. So there's no separation. There's no barrier. There's no boundary at all. So if there's no boundary, if there's no limit, then how do I identify myself?